I'm Nicholas Kristof. I'm a columnist for the New York Times. I've made 8 trips to the Darfur region, and I keep going back because of the images of what I've seen on those trips. And in particular, there's one image that I'll never get out of my mind, and that was when I made a very early trip there to the area. I arrived at an oasis on the Chad-Sudan border, and I found 30,000 people who had fled their villages after their villages had been attacked by the Sudanese Air Force and by the Janjaweed, and they were sheltering under trees. And so I did what a journalist does. I went from tree to tree, asking people their stories. Under the very first tree, there was a man who had been shot in the neck and in the jaw. His jaw had been pretty much blown away, and he'd been left for dead in a pile of bodies. His brother had only been shot in the foot and managed to escape, and then came back that night to bury the dead, and found this brother still alive, carried him on his back for 49 days to get to this oasis to try to keep his brother alive. Well, that was the first person I talked to there. Under the very next tree, right next to it, there was a woman, Magbula, from a village called Ableha, and Magbula told me how her parents had been killed in front of her and their bodies thrown into the village well to poison them so that nobody else could ever live in that village of Ableha again. And later, the rest of the men and her clan had been tracked down, and they had all been killed as well. Under the next tree, right next to those first two, there were 2 little orphans, a 5-year-old girl and her 1-year-old baby sister, who she was carrying on her back. And they'd been left alone in the world because their parents and their older siblings had all been killed. And there they were, just trying to stay alive in this incredible chaos. Under the next tree, under the 4th tree, where I tried to do my interviews, there was a woman called Zahra, and she told me how when the Janjaweed came, they had grabbed her 2 infant children from her arms, thrown them down on the ground, killed them, killed her husband, and then kidnapped Zahra along with 2 of her sisters for a week, gang raped them, killed her sisters, and left Zahra naked in the desert after mutilating her leg to stigmatize her forever as a rape victim. Well, those were the first 4 trees where I did my interviews, and I think what really got to me was I looked around, and everywhere, for as far as I could see in every direction, there were more trees and more people with stories just like those. And that is when the full brutality and also the scale of the atrocities really hit home to me, and the sense that here we have a genocide unfolding, and shortly at that time the world was just commemorating the Rwandan genocide and expressing our regret at having failed to do anything there, and here it was just unfolding once more. And it's those images that kind of drive me to go back again and again. And unfortunately, today you can find the same kinds of stories, the same things going on. The Sudanese government, of course, claims that there are indeed clashes going on, but that it has nothing to do with that. That is complete poppycock. You go out to Darfur. One of the occasions when I think I felt that most clearly was I was driving on the road in South Darfur, and this was, in Sudanese terms, a major road. There were a lot of military checkpoints along it, and I was coming back from a village where 50 people had been massacred, including small children, and there were a bunch of widows outside the village trying to figure out how they could keep themselves and their surviving children alive, and asking me for advice about where they could go to be safe. And of course, I had no idea. And I spotted a group of Janjaweed on that very road, and they were passing through these checkpoints. The military and the police didn't even try to stop them, and the Janjaweed who were wearing military uniforms given to them by the Sudanese government. And then at one of these checkpoints that was just waving the Janjaweed through, they stopped me, but worse, they tried to arrest my interpreter. And this was a kid who I'd hired for a few days because he spoke good English. He was a university student. And they grabbed him and told me and my photographer to drive on. They said, "This has nothing to do with you. We're just going to hold him for investigation." It was pretty clear to us and to him that this investigation was going to end with him getting a bullet in the head 5 minutes later. And it was very scary for all of us. The photographer and I, we stayed. We tried to bribe the police to let him go. We tried to sweet talk them. We said we couldn't go, and at that point they arrested us as well. But it's much more complicated to execute or cause problems for people with white skin and blue passports. And so they held us and radioed their commander to come. And they held us in this little detention hut with a mural of somebody being skewered in the stomach with a pole. And it was an incredibly depressing place to spend some time. But then the commander came, and he eventually released all of us. But the fact that you have these checkpoints, doing that to a young person who speaks English and is interpreting for foreign journalists while letting the Janjaweed through, just underscored to me the degree to which Sudan is just intimately involved and knows exactly what is going on. Now, I think one of the dangers that people, is they feel a futility. This has been going on for year after year. They've called their member of Congress, and it still goes on. But there also, you go out there and you do see hundreds of thousands of people who are alive who wouldn't be if it weren't for the aid that is going out. I wish we were doing more, but the fact that people have been making those calls does mean that there are a lot of people alive who otherwise wouldn't be. But it's great that we're providing food and medical care, but it just feels so inadequate out there. I know a young American woman who was an aid worker there, and she tells one story that is just haunts me. She was working in an area in Darfur where the Janjaweed were still active, and so she spoke to two sisters, and she had to get them apart from the Janjaweed, but finally she got their story, and they told how the Janjaweed had moved into the village, and 50 of them had occupied her family home, her clan home, and they had forced that clan to be their slaves, in effect, to get water for them, to get firewood, to kill their livestock, to feed them, and in the case of these two sisters, to sleep with the Janjaweed. And finally, their father had mustered his courage after a few days and had gone to the commander of the Janjaweed in their home, the commander of these 50 Janjaweed, and had gotten down on his knees and begged the man and said, "We'll do anything you want, but just please let my daughters go." And then the commander had called in these two girls and beheaded their father in front of them. And this was going on, in an area that aid workers could reach, that American aid workers could reach. And my friend said, well, what can we give you? Can we give you food, medical care? And the two sisters said, there's nothing you can give at this point. We just want to die. And things like that are going on. You feel it's great that we're providing food and medical care, but it just seems so incredibly inadequate. Maybe the final thing I'd say is that I think there's a tendency from afar just to think of Darfuris as victims, and these terrible things are unfolding there, and it's all being done to them. And indeed, it's true that you go out there and you see, the worst of humanity. Genocide is, by definition, the worst of crimes. But what maybe doesn't come through is that alongside what is really evil, you also see some of the best of humanity. And time and again, you see Darfuris who have nothing, sharing that nothing with other people who've been affected by the genocide, or showing incredible courage and trying to mitigate the effects of the genocide. And one of those people who I was just left incredibly impressed by was a woman called Suad, who had fled Darfur and gone to a camp in Chad called Gazamir Camp. And Suad knew all about the brutality of the Janjaweed rapes because her next-door neighbor was a young girl, I think 13, who'd been kidnapped for a week by the Janjaweed, and after being repeatedly raped, had been crippled ever after as a result. And Suad saw her every day and knew through that just what the Janjaweed rapes are like. But after a couple of years, the Janjaweed had followed, had gone into Chad, and followed the people in this camp, and were surrounding Gozamir camp. And yet the people in it needed to go out for firewood. And so one day, Suad was out there with her younger sister, Halima, and the Janjaweed came roaring up on their camels, and Suad told Halima, "You run to the camp, you escape to the camp, and in fact I'll create a diversion." And that's exactly what she did. And she, Suad ran the other way and let herself get caught, and her sister was able to get to the camp and was not caught, while Suad was caught, was gang raped by 8 people, and had to be carried on a cot back to the camp because of the brutality and beatings that she got. But she also did show a real kind of moral courage out there in just the most desperate circumstances. And I think it's important to remember the Darfuris in situations like that for their courage, as well as just for being victims. And I sure wish as well that we could emulate that kind of moral courage that Suad showed, and we could stand up to genocide as effectively as she did.